Good morning or afternoon, as we've just heard, depending upon where you are in the country. And welcome to our second Extension Delivery Partner webinar hosted by Hort Innovation Extension Team. It is awesome that you could be with us today, and we're really looking forward to exploring the topic of segmentation with you during this webinar. I am Olive Hood, and I am Regional Extension Manager for Northern Australia. I'm joined today by Adrian Englefield, who is also our co-chair for the webinar and is Manager for Southeast Australia. And our team leader, Jane Whiteman, who is Manager for Northeast, along with additional new members, Jason Hingston, Manager for Southern Australia, Jay Cummins in the Tri-State, and Bronwyn Walsh over there in the West. We are also joined today by Sean Kenny from the Rural Consulting Group, who is our guest presenter and also our panelist today. Thank you, Sean. We're looking forward to your presentation. And lastly, but not least, many thanks to Caitlin Morris, who you would have met at the last webinar, who is our event and technology specialist online with us today. And on that note, we want to record this webinar. So if you have any concerns or queries about that, please message Caitlin Morris direct, and I'm sure she'll be able to accommodate you. Okay, today's topic is segmentation. The segmentation as a body of work originated in marketing, where brands began to recognise that their customers weren't just one single customer. Their customer groups were actually internally able to be clearly differentiated by groups of customers who could be separated according to their preferences and their attitudes and their languages, and that if they could better accommodate those differences in the way that they went about their work, then they'd be able to achieve better outcomes. Segmentation is increasingly being applied to extension practice, with a recent study concluding that segmentation has an important contribution to make to extension because it allows groups of industry to be able to innovate in ways that are personally relevant to them through matching their circumstances, their networks of influence, and their mindsets. Therefore, segmentation is a very important topic for contemporary extension practice. So we're delighted to bring it to you today in this webinar segment. So we thought at this point we'd just pause and gauge where we are all at on our segmentation journey by asking you to identify which coloured section on this bullseye best reflects your current understanding and use of segmentation in your extension practice. We'll be using Zoom's Annotate function to do this. So if you haven't done that, just move the mouse to the top of the screen, and next to the green bar is a drop-down menu. Open and click Annotate. Choose a star and click the mouse on the section of the bullseye that resonates with where you currently are in your segmentation journey. Thanks. Awesome. So we're starting to see that our segmentation audience is somewhat segmented, where there is some groups of people in the red and then some groups of people in lesser groups of people in the teal section. And that's awesome. That gives us a starting point upon which we can build this segmentation webinar. So turning back to the webinar, it will proceed as follows. First, Sean Kenny will provide us with segmentation food for thought. Next, we will go on to a breakout group session where the regional extension managers that I introduced to you earlier will facilitate a small group practically orientated discussion about segmentation in practice. Then Adrian will facilitate a question and answer where any questions and observations or points of discussion that you would like to delve into deeper can be had there in that Q&A panel and considered further. So in order to get the ball rolling, I'll pass over to Adrian, our co-chair, to introduce Sean Kenny.
Thanks, Olive. Today's presenter is Sean Kenny, who is the Director of the Rural Consulting Group. Specialising in extension research, design and evaluation, RCG have recent experience supporting the development and delivery of extension strategies within the sugar, red meat, poultry, vegetable and dairy sectors through government and private sector organisations. Our goal today is to get you thinking about segmentation and how to use it to refine and focus extension design for more targeted and relevant project outputs, leading to production changes. That is, segmentation is a tool helping to describe the who and the what, and therefore aids in defining extension scope. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sean for his presentation.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks for using that photo. Makes me look much younger. It's obviously a pre-COVID one. That one, less hair and less wrinkles. Thanks for having me here. It's an interesting topic, segmentation. And let me just start by saying I don't by any means consider myself an expert. I'm someone who has found themselves applying and using it in practice for, best part of 15 years now, I guess. My background, I'm what I call an accidental agriculturalist, in that I started in marine ecology, found myself in extension, and I've always asked questions around, what extension is and how it works. And so segmentation was one of those ones where I asked a lot of questions early on in my career around extension about, why, who, how. There was a lot of taken for granted stuff in how extension's done, and as there still is. And so that's where, my experience with this comes from. So I'll just roll through this. If at any time you can't hear me or something jumps out at you, maybe capture it as a comment somewhere, and we can try and gather it up later on. But let's see how we go. So basic overview of what I want to talk about is segmentation as a design tool. There is a bit of a thinking out there that you can segment an individual, and if you get your segmentation right, you'll unlock some magic which will enable us to get better adoption of technology or practice X or Y or Z. That's a bit of a myth around segmentation, and my understanding or my experience of segmentation is what it does is it helps you design a better project and put you in the space for greater success. It doesn't guarantee it. I want to talk a little bit about some of the types of segmentation that are relevant to agricultural extension and design, and I'll walk through an example of a project that we use different types of segmentation in, just to give you a bit of context for that. So, as I said, segmentation helps us design better projects because it draws our attention to the inherent diversity in every context. Now, as humans, we have a natural capacity to simplify, and it's an adaptive mechanism that serves us really well. Where it doesn't help us is when things get a little bit complex. Problems don't lend themselves to simple solutions. And a little tip is that anything to do with human beings will never lend itself to a simple solution. So that's where we've got to do a double take on our simplifying tools. Now, segmentation is ultimately a simplification of reality, but it takes us down the path from gross generalizations to more refined generalizations to help us make sense of what we're doing. It's an abstraction of reality, and so there are limits to it, but it helps. And various segmentation techniques can be used at different stages of the design process. So design frameworks for change projects, you may be familiar with certain things that you use, you may not. There's a bit that's assumed with extension that we think long and hard about what we're doing before we do it. And I think there's a dirty little secret out there that we don't necessarily think that much about our design. We do a bit based on what we've always done. But, you know, we can use different frameworks. We can use things like Bennett's hierarchy. We can use logic frameworks. But the truth with extension is that one size doesn't fit all. And so what we talk about in design is just there are certain things that you have to address through your design process. And projects need to be built around some form of logic which spells out these following next elements. And by understanding these, we can then think about where we might apply segmentation. The first thing a decent design process has to do is to define what the problem or opportunity might be that you're attempting to realize or address. Now, this seems obvious, but it's actually something that's not done to a great enough extent. The presenting problem isn't always the problem at hand. And largely in extension, we deal with more problems and opportunities because we're operating in a public goods space. Opportunity is something that's typically more entrepreneurial and private sector based, not saying we don't do it, but if the opportunities are great, chances are the money will find them. So typically we work in problem spaces or gaps. The second thing is we need to clarify what people are not doing, which is leading to the problem and opportunity being in existence. And we call this the practice gap. In extension, we talk about practice change. We can't talk about change if we don't have a before and after type understanding of what change we're trying to address. So we've got to clarify that at some stage. And again, that's something we don't necessarily do in extension. We need some sense of scope and focus within a project to address the practice gap. And I just refer to these objectives. What's the change you're trying to bring about? With who? And again, often we talk in terms of all farmers, all regions, all industries, and we don't have a really clear sense of which bit, how do we scope this piece of work up? We need to clarify what the benefits of addressing the practice gap might be, and that's about the value proposition to investors and practitioners. Who or what needs to change to address the problem opportunity to realise this is about target audiences, and that's clearly an obvious spot where we can think about segmentation. What strategies will help us to achieve the change, who we need to work with and the kind of skills we need to execute the project, which is about capability and collaboration, and what the whole thing's going to cost and therefore what the benefit costs might be. And again, it's something we don't do a lot of, but we might have a really clear problem, we might have a really good strategy, but the benefits versus the costs just aren't worth it, so we don't bother. So where does segmentation thinking fit in this change sort of framework? Well, it helps us to clarify who has the problem. It helps us clarify who is not doing what. It helps us understand who might benefit or who needs to be targeted. So it can help address the who question within that. It can also help us when we're interested in the how type questions as well. So for example, how might we best engage the target audience? And that speaks to things like attitudes, preferences, how we might get access to certain cohorts and groups, and how might we know something has changed and how might we evaluate that? So segmentation can help us with the how and the who, and it also helps us with thinking about the where, which is relevant within an agricultural context as well. So why does segmentation help us address these elements of design? Well, it helps refine and bound the project, and it reduces the risk of poorly targeted and inefficient project delivery. And this is key, particularly for something like extension that is often asked, what is it that you do? What are you going to achieve? And so by being able to describe really clearly the who, the what, and the where, and refining it, avoiding scope creep and these sorts of things, puts us in the game for a much better focused project. And segmentation helps us with evaluation. We always say that the key to evaluation is design. We even, we talk about design-based evaluation. Evaluation is not something you add on the end. Evaluation is central to design, and you design a project properly, you articulate the who and the what and the change, straight away you structure your evaluation really clearly. So by defining audience, change, benefits, and strategies, we've effectively built our evaluation plans through the design process. So that's how segmentation helps us in design. The types of segmentation that can help us who, where, how many, and what do they do, that we've had experience with using over before is we can segment based on scale of operations. So these are classic sort of economic metrics that are often used in agriculture. The biggest producers, the ones who are the most productive, the most profitable potentially, some of these things that are about size differences we can use to chop up our segments, our audience, and think about them differently. Geography is another one, where they are, what regions they're in, and this is particularly relevant for particular types of agriculture. I know in dairy, there are distinctive regional differences in production systems which are very relevant. And you just saw at the start here, horticulturists split themselves up into different regions, clearly based on a number of things, one of which is the biophysical dimensions of what's going on. Soils then play a factor as well. So that's geography, that's within particular regional settings. Largely agriculture is still anchored in agronomics to a certain extent. So soils matter, and soils drive certain things within what we do. Climate differences, practices. So where are our audience on a spectrum of practice improvement, or room for improvement is a measure that we've used before. Some of these things you can measure through self-assessment of current practice. Attitudes is one that's been used a fair bit in the last 10 years, and that's sort of a derived attitudinal segmentation that looks at attitudes around business growth, attitudes to risk, attitudes towards change, and targeting different segments based on that. And then there's your demographics, age, height, whatever it is about your population that you're interested in from a demographic point of view. And as I said before, segmentation is as much a way of thinking as it is a product. It's not so much about the output at the end, whilst that can be quite helpful. It's a process you go through to think about these different things that really starts to refine your thinking and take you beyond some of those gross generalizations at the start to get you more specific in what you're doing. And the other thing about segmentation is people often feel like, we've got to do a segmentation project to understand our clients or our market better. And that's sometimes the case, but I've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars dropped on segmentation that's never used, whereas some of the simple segmentations that you can use with pre-existing data will give you most of what you want in terms of targeting a project. And I often say, whilst we don't know everything, we do know lots of things about the context we work in. And that's based on experience. We might not have the data, but we have a hell of a lot of working hypotheses around these sorts of things that we can simply use, because what's the alternative? You're going to guess either way. So have an educated guess and carve up your audience and use expertise and practitioners to help refine that. And that's really what we did in this next example in a couple of areas. This case study was from a project we called the Feed-Based Challenge. And they were groups we set up within the dairy sector. And this was about using segmentation to aid in project design. The project spoke to a collaborative learning model of change. And it was really about a farmer-centered or action learning based approach. So all these things are really relevant to extension right now. Peer-to-peer learning, farmer-centered, collaborative models. This is right in the slot in terms of where extension is trying to go. So the feed-based challenge groups were designed to increase the number of dairy businesses achieving some key performance indicators that were set for the industry by the industry. And this related to, I don't know how many of you got a livestock background, but dry matter consumption matters. We don't need to go into detail. Milk production obviously matters for dairy farmers, and cost of production matters for all farmers. So there were some key performance indicators around each of those, which the industry had set some targets around shifting. Now, rather than just go and assume what to do, we started out by designing. So we wanted to understand, what, where, and for who this challenge around feed base might be for. And so we looked at farmer segmentation. So, the people. We looked at landscape segmentation, and we looked at practice type segmentation as we went. So some key questions with the segmentation dimension were, What's the current performance and scope for improvement in homegrown feed management? And this is about practices. What are people currently doing? We've got to collect some data on that. And that helps us segment the market about who's doing what and who's not. Where are the farms in each region and what are the biological limits to homegrown feed improvement? Again, things are assumed about this, but it's not documented and it's not clarified in the design process. So we wanted to know geographically where people by practices were. We wanted to know who our dairy farmers were and what their attitudes to improvement were. So this was about, the classic demographics and attitudinal stuff. And we wanted to know what the current service offering was in the marketplace. We didn't want to just assume that Extension had a job to do here. So these are the main types of segmentations we wanted to play with. How we did it, we did some desktop analysis of existing data and information around industry performance, diversity, and I've just referenced a couple of relevant segmentation, derived attitudinal farmer segments. I can follow up with some references for that if you want. But what I'm suggesting here is that there will be a lot of work that's been done for your industry. Well, not all of them, some of the larger ones, but you can pinch from other industries as well, and you can pinch generic stuff about agriculture. So the desktop stuff's important to get you in the jungle. We did some regional mapping work to spatially display farmer locations, scales, climates, and soils. And this is really powerful stuff because you can get a picture of physically where people are, and then you can use that with workshops and with participants to say, you say you got a problem, how does it relate to this problem? Where are these farmers here? What scale are we talking about? Have we got one region? Have we got 4 regions within a region? What are we talking about? And I'll show you a bit of an output from that in a second. We did a farmer self-assessment of capability in key management areas, and that was where we got them to assess where they were with regards to room for improvement around 5 or 6 key practice areas. We got advisors to assess their clients across the same things to get a bit of triangulation. And we did a regional workshop where we brought all that information together and we just walked people through it, and we got them to interpret what it meant, which was quite a powerful exercise. So just go back to that slide, Caitlin, for a sec. So this stuff, has real power. It's relatively simple. The regional mapping had a bit of expertise, but again, they spit these things out in an hour. But having a platform to talk about this stuff was the key, because otherwise people just fall back on opinion. But once you got some data, you can then have some meaningful conversations. And none of this was complicated at all. So, again, from a segmentation point of view, you don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get this stuff. You can actually play with a lot of what you've already got. So the regional mapping output, this next one, it's a bit hard to see. There's a red rash in there, which doesn't show up on the slide real well, but that was where the dairy farmers were. And so then we got workshop participants to draw circles around what they thought were agronomically different areas. And also culturally different areas. You'll see 4 and 5 there. That's the McAllister River runs through the middle of that. There was east and west of the river. So apparently something weird happens on the west-hand side and something different happens on the east-hand side. So, they were adamant that they're 2 different groups and they need to be treated differently, even though the soils, climate, everything might have been the same. So that's good. That's good insight when you're trying to pull a group together, because you don't want, Easterns and Westerns together, because it'd be a debacle. So, this was a powerful exercise to really work out, okay, we need 5 groups in this region to try and engage around, what's happening in my backyard and what's relevant. The other thing was around farmer preferences for information. And this is just classic stuff that's always available. And surprise, surprise, other farmers, discussion groups, field days were right up there in terms of what people use for information. Note Department of Ag staff were really down the bottom. Training courses were okay, but the peer-to-peer stuff come out again. And we do this sort of zonal mapping stuff where we get people to say, who's close to you in terms of decision making and who's a bit further away in terms of sources and people you use. And again, that's about getting in the jungle about, all right, if we want to engage people, let's find a trusted advisor, let's get them to work together, let's do all these things. Now, they're things that we all intuitively might know. This provides some data to it and gives you real confidence going forward. We'll skip the next one just for time there, Caitlin, I think. So what did we find? We had lack of data collection on farm. I think I've talked about most of these sorts of things already. Farmer preferences were peer-to-peer stuff. There was a lack of a coherent narrative in the domain, and just the key of farmer-directed peer-to-peer learning approaches. So what do we do in response to some of that stuff? Just jump onto the next one, Caitlin. We used local zones to focus recruitment, which is about my backyard, and that was that map I showed before. We got them to measure KPIs because, it wasn't being done. So we couldn't actually track where practice was. We didn't have any data. So let's measure it. That's a good idea. We got them to develop individual action plan that made it specific to them. And then we got them to compare it with each other, which dealt with this peer-to-peer and challenge-based stuff to say, well, you think you're doing a good job. Are you really? And taking away that, well, they're different to me. We're all the same here. So we've got no excuses. We then ran some group activities developed by farmers to target the shared needs. So we looked at where the gaps were in performance and said, righto, let's go and have a look at that and see what we can do. And then we used some individual coaching to embed change. And this was a real light touch follow-up on the phone. How you going? No worries. It wasn't heavy. The whole aim here was to do extension light. Can we do this in a way that wasn't, a 4 or 5 day program, 5 on-farm days, just trying to flog a dead horse? Can we get to the outcome as quickly as we can? So where are we up to? How'd the approach work? Well, we saw change in all the indicators. So is that graph there, Caitlin? Yep. So these are the 3 indicators. And then we compared performance of participants in the group by regional averages over the same couple of years that were collected through an industry benchmarking program. The orange is participants in our program. The blue is the industry averages. So on average, we saw an increase in the first KPI over and above what happened at an industry level. We saw a slight shift in KPI 2, which was neither here nor there. But this one was the big one, the third one. This is a bit backwards, but this was about cost of production. So a reduction is actually good. And we saw a significant change in that KPI relevant when compared to the industry average. So, this was some good data. Not necessarily perfect, but it just shows there was a shift. In terms of change, 66% said they'd already made changes and they'd seen these sorts of benefits. More homegrown feed, they'd already seen it and they expected to see more. Increased milk production, they'd seen some, they expected to see more. And reduced feed costs, they'd already seen it and they expected to see more. So, this was generally a positive approach. Was it due to some segmentation alone? Who knows? But this is a good set of data to say, well, that project was effective and we had a really good line of sight from the start to the finish about what we were doing. So learning from the approach, segmentation doesn't automatically deliver better outcomes in projects. There's a lot that went on around this that may or may not have influenced it, but we think that it was a well-designed project. So that gets you to first base. It's tempting to fall into the segmentation of the individual trap where you think you can find the key to unlock something. That's not the case. I think segmentation happens at a population scale, whatever that population might be. So it's about getting yourself in the right jungle and then, going from there. The power is to help us to consider diversity and so design our projects in a focused and realistic way. And that's why I think it's best to see segmentation as a design tool to be used in conjunction with a whole lot of other things when you're developing and designing projects. So that's all from me. Over to you, Adrian.
So thank you very much. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you, Sean. Pretty good food for thought and provides the foundation for us as we move into the next session of discussions in breakout rooms. Before we go to the breakout rooms, just a little bit of an overview of what's going to happen there. So each breakout room will be facilitated by a regional extension manager, and they will facilitate a discussion loosely based on 2 practical questions that will hope tease out some of the information that was in Sean's presentation. The purpose is to share experiences and ideas about using segmentation in our extension practice. We have allocated 15 minutes to this to the breakout room, so we will go and visit them now and see you in 15 minutes.
Now we're going to move on to a very quick 10-minute Q&A session. So I'm sure there was lots of good discussion in your breakout rooms and further learnings from Sean's presentation. If you have any questions at all that you would like to ask either Sean or Olive, please pop them in the chat box, and if time permits, we'll be able to work through them. If not, we will certainly answer those questions and share them via the email and resources that we share from after this webinar. So our first question comes from Danielle that was sent in during the registration process. And I'm just wondering, Sean and Olive, if you can please describe methods or examples to combine the use of farmer case studies with segmentation. We might go over to you first, Sean.
So there's a question about how you do it or why you do it?
Well, the importance of it and what's critical in tying farmer case studies in with segmentation.
Well, I guess it depends on what you're doing, but the case study gives a rich description. So, you know, I mean, you'd use a case study or a vignette or something to provide a description of what a typical example of a particular segment might be. And again, you know, that's depending on what you're trying to do, that can be useful. It can also lock in a kind of perspective around what a proactive farmer is, or who the operators are, and who are likely to change and who aren't. And, you know, again, experience would suggest that that's always partially true. So, you know, case studies or vignettes are helpful in a descriptive fashion, I would have thought, where there's particular typologies, if you like, that you're trying to describe. Yeah, that's probably what I'd say about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sean. I think, yeah, it's about really trying to match your intention with the case study with what you had in, if you have segmentation in your process, then I could see how it could potentially be a match made in heaven if done well, in terms of being able to really provide some detail around your segments.
I guess the other thing just thinking about too is that, you know, if case studies can form part of a communication strategy to speak to certain segments. So if there are certain attributes of the population that you feel speak to a particular group, you can use case studies to associate individuals together to sort of support a change program.
Yeah, agree.
Just touching on your comment there about locking in perspectives, Sean. In my previous extension projects and work, I often worked with project reference groups, and we generally identified group-based problems. So to overcome group-based problems and further truly segment, what advice would you have to someone that's new to segmentation?
I always encourage people when they use the collective of anything to say some. So, you know, rather than they or farmers, say some. As soon as you shift that thinking, you automatically are breaking a pattern of overgeneralization. So, I mean, stereotypes, grouping, and those sorts of things we do for a reason, and largely that they stand at a certain level. You know, they make sense. It's when we go too far with them, or we stretch them to cover off a population group that's not relevant to the problem. So farmers as distinct to non-farmers might be a relevant categorization. But when we say that farmers don't do X, Y, Z, if we say some, then we're in a much better space to kind of think about, well, who are the some that might not? And we're also acknowledging the fact that there are some that do exactly what we think is right, good, or important. And we don't annoy everyone by just clumping everyone into one group. So that would be, you know, number one. Always qualify what you're saying when you're using generalizations.
Yeah, in my breakout session, a few people were talking about when they talked about what they currently do, which they talked about it in terms of intuitively doing it, or, you know, I do parts of that, but I haven't really seen it formalized like that. So I would just encourage people to really just tap into that and spend some time around that, of of trying to articulate what they're currently doing, which they're doing in already in an intuitive or an informal way, and also to pick up the things that they saw today. Like in my group, we were talking about the things that we currently do and then things that we could do now that we've sort of had a bit of a think about it. So that would, I guess, be my next step that I would be doing, is pick one of those things and have a go and see how that refines your approach, and particularly for the group I was talking to, which they were really, correct me if I'm not capturing this well, but I thought you were excited about the opportunity that segmentation gives you to really generate some evidence about the impact that you're having, because you've got an understanding of where your current groups are at, and you've got a really targeted approach to how you're going to attempt to influence that, and then you're going to have some data at the end that's going to really show you what the impact was.
Thanks, Olive. I've just got a question that's been put in the chat function. How do you decide how many growers and advisors to survey? And does it stop when a trend starts to show, or are there other considerations as well?
Yeah, good question. So there's a bit of a principle within qualitative research around, saturation, where you're hearing the same thing over and over again is generally a good sign it's time to stop. More is not always better with certain forms of qualitative research, and particularly with the sort of things that you're doing within your own resources. You're not going to have the capacity to generate massive data sets to do quantitative stuff around it. So whenever you're in the qualitative space, it's really about making a justification for your data collection method. So there's two things there. One is I work on is this idea of saturation. You're seeing a pattern, so then you sort of stop. And then there's face validity of the story you're telling. So if it stands up with your interpretation, I'd always then test it with another group to say, here's what we did. Here was our thinking and rationale. Do you share our conclusions? And if they think it's bunkum, then we've got some work to do around shoring ourselves up. But it's interesting. There are some sort of number thresholds that persistently repeat around saturation with qualitative stuff. But yeah, I think that's something you got to work through and discover for yourself a bit, I reckon, rather than me giving you a number. That would be risky, I think. Does that answer the question?
I agree.
Yeah.
Very good. Now, the last question that we have here today, Sean, I did a little bit of searching for extension segmentation resources, and as Olive touched on earlier, that segmentation is heavily focused in the marketing space. I didn't find many resources at all, but I'm just wondering if you can touch on where any interested participants today would be able to access further insights on segmentation and potentially the challenge group approach that you took in your demonstration.
Yes, I guarantee you that every RDC has a segmentation report somewhere. So it would be commercial in confidence, which is rather ironic, I would have thought. So I would be making some inquiries within your research and development corporation about something. I know for a fact that, well, I don't know for a fact about horticulture, Jane, but I would suspect there would be something there. So there's that internal query about they'll share something with you. So there's a start. There are certainly, if you do a Google Scholar search of segmentation in agriculture industries, you'll find certain things. There are a couple that are published. So they're derived attitudinal farmer segments by, I've just had a blank. It'll come back to me. Wilkinson et al., which is segmenting Victorian farmers, I'm fairly sure is published as well. There's a really interesting paper, Kuhn's paper on the adopt model, which isn't specifically a segmentation paper, but it's in the context of adoption and diffusion, so the idea of transfer of technology, it is what I'd say it gives you everything you need in terms of all the references that you want about what we know about all the different things that make people tick with regards to adoption. It's an underused resource, that paper, I'd say. So there are a few things from an academic and published point of view with data. Then I think the other ones is ABARES. You can generate a lot out of industry surveys and data from ABARES. I use ABS stats for certain things. And then you just trawl and play with, you know, climate data, mapping data, soil data, all that. Most of it is around. If you need help, particularly on some of the biophysical mapping stuff, there are technical mapping dudes who, you know, they might charge $150 an hour or something to generate them, but they can generate a map like that one I produced in an hour. So you can actually, you know, this data, they just layer data. And if you're someone like Sylvia with LLS, I reckon you probably have that capacity in-house somewhere for someone who might do that stuff. So you've just got to hunt around, know what you sort of half want, and you'll find it. You'll find something. That's what I said. You don't know everything, but you know something. And that's more than anyone else has ever put together. That's always been my attitude is, well, if you've got better information, give it to me, I'll use it. Otherwise, let's use this half-assed information I've pulled together and as a starting point, because right now we don't have a story to tell. We're assuming everything. So always just make a start, and then you've got something to argue properly about.
Rightio, thanks Sean and Olive for your answers, and we'll certainly share some of those resources with the follow-up email from this webinar. So now we're going to move to the wrap-up of today's proceedings, and I just wanted to quickly, before I hand back to Olive, just provide a quick reminder about the Australasian Pacific Extension Network mentoring program that Hort Innovation is facilitating a horticulture cohort for their delivery partners. And the mentoring program is not going to start until early next year, so we still have plenty of time for registrations and further information. So if you are interested in participating in the program as either a mentor or a mentee, please feel free to contact me for further information. And once again, we'll share some links and some contacts in the follow-up email from today's webinar as well. So over to you, Olive.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you for co-chairing with me today. Thank you, Sean, for bringing your valuable experience to the insights and contributions that you've made today to our webinar. And thank you to our partners for your attendance and participation. Your commitment to your extension practice is evident, and I thank you for it. The resources and links and webinar summary will be heading to your inbox. That's been mentioned today. Will be heading to your inbox shortly, so please look out for them. And just a heads up that the next Delivery Partner Extension webinar will be early in the new year, and we'll be focusing on on-farm trials and demonstrations. As always, feedback is a gift, so please feel free to contact us at any time, any of the team at any time, to offer feedback, extend the conversation, and your ideas. Thank you once again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.